We'll begin with Gasho. Namo Amida Buddha. Namandavats, namandavats, namandavats. So I've mentioned this before too. I like to have kind of a theme for the day. So the adult study kind of goes with the Dharma Talk. And, I don't come to OCBC every Sunday because I think one Sunday I go to different temples and I'm busy, but I'm responsible for getting the talks up onto YouTube, on our YouTube channel. And I watched Reverend Rada, I think at least one, maybe two Sundays. He's been talking a lot about the Pure Land and the 6 realms and whether the Pure Land is here now or is it somewhere when we die. And in general, my approach to Buddhism, I get very suspicious when there's pairs of opposites. Like there were 14 questions that people asked the Buddha that he wouldn't answer, and a lot of them were these kind of pairs of opposite questions. And the other thing I always tell people, the answer to all Buddhist questions is and. So, my tendency to say is the Pure Land is here and now, and when you die. So I really like that wave and the ocean metaphor that Reverend Rada uses. So, the wave isn't the ocean, but its essence is no different from the ocean. So even though you're a wave and you're living along the surface, you can still touch this depth of the ocean in the here and now. And when you die, the wave doesn't die when it hits the shore, right? We don't say that in English. The wave returns back to the sea. It returns back to its source. And this metaphor works really well because when you're born, you manifest form. You come out of the ocean as a wave, and then you lose form and you return back to the source. And most Western people are worried about where you go when you die, but a lot of Buddhists think about, where was I before I was born? There's all these causes and conditions until you rise up as a human being and you live your life and then you return back. So that's kind of the way I think about life and death. So it's a metaphor, but you can push on it pretty hard and it won't fall over. So some metaphors fall over easy when you poke at them. But metaphors are, they're meant to illustrate a point. So I brought a couple things to read, two-sided, going over this idea of nirvana as being a two-step process, even in the Buddha's life. So on page 1, I've got my candle picture. So again, the metaphor in India was understood as the flame is out, but there's still a latent fire. All that energy and fuel is still there and can recombust at any moment. So, the fire's out, but you're not really, out of the woods. You're not done. And this comes from a book called Metaphor and Literalism in Buddhism. It's by Routledge Publishing, and anytime Routledge publishes a book, it's like a $400 book. So I was able to find this on the internet as a PDF. I told you I'm a computer programmer. Nobody can stop me. You cannot stop me. So I downloaded it, I printed it out, and I read it. And basically, from the earliest Buddhist texts, you can see the Buddha as still fully human even after his awakening under the Bodhi tree. And I have here, traditionally, December 8th is called Bodhi Day, and February 15th is traditionally called Nirvana Day, but I think it's more accurate to call today Nirvana Day and the 15th Parinirvana Day. And this is interesting too. I didn't bring it with me because I had 2 statues and I didn't want to bring books, but the Nirvana Sutra is a very famous text in Mahayana Buddhism. It's one of the foundational texts for Shinran, and if you go by it, it says right on the cover, the Nirvana Sutra, but it's about the Buddha's death. And when you read the notes, it says that the actual title is the Maha Prajapati Sutra, the great, end-of-life awakening sutra. So, even the text has been abbreviated and it's a little misleading. And then on page 1, we have this example. I think in my slides I used vow 17, and here I'm using vow 18, but all the vows, 1 through 48, when I attain Buddhahood at 35, May I not achieve these things during my 45 years of practice. May I not realize perfect enlightenment at the end of life. So they're all in this two-stage, two-step format. And then, again, I have these 2 lines from the Sambutsuge. It's translated as the 3 poisons are forever absent in the Buddha, but it's more accurate to say ignorance, greed, and anger, they don't last long. That's what makes somebody a Buddha, is it doesn't last long. It's not that they're absent. So this is kind of inflating the idea of Buddhahood into something that's not really realizable by everyday people. And so that I kind of like the fact that maybe Buddhahood at 35 under the Bodhi tree is more accessible than we think. If you make it less grand, that makes it more accessible. So now it seems like something a little bit more reasonable, right? You don't have to be a completely different person. You just have to be aware and kind of not be burning up all the time with anger, ignorance, and greed. So I wanted to read some quotes to show you that I'm not just making this all up. So on page 106 in this book, Metaphor and Literalism, so this is a really good book. He goes through the texts and he shows where people have gotten metaphor and literal interpretations of metaphor and where people get confused. So when you read the text, you have to understand when is it being literal and when is it being a metaphor. And then sometimes in the text, there's actually humor. There's actually, one scholar went through, there's actually jokes and stuff and humor in the sutras. But when we read religious texts, we're very serious and we miss the joke. I mean, it was meant to be funny. Like sometimes Hindu people are made fun of a little bit because they're the other guys, or yoga people get made fun of a little bit because it's a Buddhist text. So there's like little jokes here and there. So the first quote is, Nirvana with remainder of clinging could not originally mean enlightenment or sainthood or arhat, but meant non-returner, a state in which there still were some attachments left to be perfected. And I like this because it has the word turner in it. So I'm a non-returner. That was a joke. On page 167, certain ancient texts say that Gautama was assailed by the temptations of Mara after his enlightenment. So Mara is kind of the metaphoric symbol for ignorance, anger, and greed. An outstanding feature of Gautama's life was his self-awareness, his ability to withstand temptation and attack through his ceaseless practice. These qualities were equally important after awakening, but later Buddhists, having deified Gautama, placed the subjugation of Mara before his enlightenment to give his biography more drama. So sometimes when you read the texts, the Buddha vanquishes Mara. He's absolutely without anger, ignorance, and greed. All of his delusions are gone. He never gets upset. He's kind of like this perfect human being, and he realizes awakening at 35. But I think they're conflating that with the one at 80. They're upselling, I think. So then in that Gautama book I mentioned, Gautama Buddha book by Hajime Nakamura, page 169, it says, people of that time regarded Mara's temptations as continuing even after the enlightenment. The scholar says, I consider this to be of great importance. The human being named Gautama did not, upon awakening, become a completely different kind of human being, a perfect being impervious to harm. Even after becoming a Buddha, he possessed weaknesses and could be pursued and tempted by Mara. So, he's still dealing with life's problems just like any other human being would. He's just a lot better at it now. So I kind of can't remember which are the footnotes and which is me. This last paragraph is me. I wrote this. So this is about the metaphor. We often hear that nirvana means blowing out the fire. This is actually a metaphor that has been interpreted too literally. In ancient India, it was understood that even after a fire has been blown out, a latent fire still exists due to the remaining fuel of the candle. In other words, the triple fires of ignorance, greed, and anger have been extinguished, but the fuel still remains. Our fuel also still exists until we die. So the best we can do in the here and now is make a wish and blow out the candle while still smoldering. So I thought some famous scholar wrote that, but I realize now it was me. That was a joke. So before we turn to page 2, does anybody have any comments or questions or? Oh, well, there's a mic. Oh.
No, just trying to complete the story of the history thing. You said the first woman of Buddhism was that Indian woman? The aunt?
Maha Prajapati.
Yeah, who is she?
So if it was Hanamatsuri, I would have talked about more, but after the Buddha was born, this is really sad. 7 days later, his mother, Queen Maya, dies. And I think this set up his entire life. Like, if your mother dies because of childbirth, there's survivor guilt. You have to deal with death. I think this is like the defining moment of his life, and I haven't seen anybody write about it. But he ends up being raised by his aunt. She adopts him as if it's her own son. And so Maha Prajapati is effectively the mother of Siddhartha. And the other thing she did that's amazing is she thought that women should be allowed into mendicant monastic practice. And she petitions the Buddha and says, I've been practicing, ever since your awakening, and I want to be on the path, and women have just as much right or ability to realize awakening as anyone else. And this story may be exaggerated a little bit. It almost sounds like the March on Selma, but she gets a lot of women with her, and they all put on saffron robes, and they shave their heads. They're not nuns yet. And they start marching across the country to the Buddha's residence at one of the monasteries. And he'd say to Ananda, where are they? Well, they're 50 miles out, and the crowd is getting bigger and bigger. And they're 25 miles out. They're 5 miles out. They're going to be here tomorrow. What are we going to do? And so some scholars say, male scholars say, often, that the Buddha allowed women into the monastic community is kind of a favor. He owed her a big one because she raised him as her mother. But a woman scholar named Jan Nadier says that's not the right way of looking at it. He wasn't doing her a favor. He wasn't lowering the bar because he felt like it was his mom. She had practiced, and she was on the verge of awakening, and she deserved to be in the monastery. If Buddhism is to promote awakening, he had to let her in. She earned it. She was of that rank. He couldn't say no. So she begins the monastic practice for women, and she taught. She lived to an old age, and when she died, the Buddha went to her funeral and walked behind her casket, which he'd never done for anyone else before, men or women. So she's a really important figure, and to this day, she's honored in memorial services and the like. Any other comments or thoughts? Oh, yeah. Was there one? Okay. So if you want, we could turn over to page 2. And I try really hard to be, accurate and follow good academic standards. I think these ends in here mean that this is from Nakamura's book, but for the life of me, I don't know what the page number is. And the rest of it is me writing. So the quotes are from Nakamura. So this kind of talks about the Buddha's life and death. In the centuries after the Buddha's death, it sometimes got to the stage that the legends and myths obscured the very real human being behind them, and the Buddha came to be looked upon as a god. Actually, the Buddha was a human being. He was no different than others, and indeed, physically, he was always remained quite ordinary. So what was the Buddha like? What would have been like to meet him? The Buddha was about 6 feet tall, with coal black hair and a golden brown complexion. When he was still a layman, He wore his hair and beard long, but on renouncing the world, he shaved them both like every other monk. So this is just very common. Most men in India, in midlife, oftentimes go on a spiritual quest. All sources agree that the Buddha was strikingly handsome. The Brahmin, Sonadanda, described him as handsome, good-looking, and pleasing to the eye, with a most beautiful complexion. A disciple said this of him, "It is wonderful, truly marvelous, how serene is the good Gautama's appearance, how clear and radiant his complexion, just as the golden jujube in autumn is clear and radiant, just as a palm tree fruit, just loosened from the stalk, is clear and radiant, just as an adornment of red gold wrought in a crucible by a skilled goldsmith, deftly beaten and laid on a yellow cloth shines, blazes, and glitters. Even so, the good Gautama's senses are calm. His complexion is clear and radiant." So I think they kind of overemphasize how good he looks. But I think it's because all people look great when they're young, right? So there's going to be a tension between how good he looked when he was young and what happens to him as he ages. So he ages just like everyone else, right? He goes from radiant youth to old age, like all human beings do. So he realizes awakening, and then this is what happens as he practices for the next 45 years. But of course, as he got older, his body succumbed to impermanence, as we all do. Ananda described him in his old age like this: "It is strange, Lord. It is a wonder how the exalted one's skin is no longer clear and radiant, how all his limbs are slack and wrinkled, how stooped his body is, and how a change is to be seen in eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body." In the last year before his final nirvana, so this final nirvana, that means parinirvana. So there's the initial nirvana, and then there's the final nirvana. In the last year before his final nirvana, the Buddha said this of himself. I love this quote. "I feel this way sometimes. I am old now, worn out, venerable, one who has walked life's path, and I have reached the end of my life, being now 80, just as an old cart can only be kept going by being held together with straps, so too the Tathagata's body can only be kept going by being held together with bandages." So as the Buddha gets older, I've told you this before, I think it's in a different book that I read. The Buddha starts taking more naps as he gets older, and he starts having other disciples teach for him. So Ananda begins to teach more because, he's 80 and he just doesn't have the energy he had when he was young. The Buddha had always been saying goodbye to his disciples. Now he prepared to leave the earth forever. He would never be reborn, never die again. The Buddha told his disciples, "It may be that after I'm gone, that some of you will think, now we have no teacher. But that is not how you should see it. Let the Dharma and the discipline that I have taught you be your teacher. All individual things pass away. Strive on untiringly." So this is kind of another version of the deathbed quote we read today during service, where he said, "Be a lamp unto yourself." So the Buddha would say, Buddhism is the Dharma. It's the teachings. It's not the person. It's not a cult of personality. So it's the teachings. And I've told you this one quote I heard by a Zen master. It was on a PBS documentary or something. The historicity of Jesus, the fact that Jesus existed in time, is kind of critical to the Christian story. But they asked a Zen master, what if it could be shown that the historical Buddha, in fact, never literally lived? It's a composite or it's a legend. How would you feel about that? And the Zen master, without thinking, said, "Oh, that would be fine. But we still have the teachings. The teachings take priority in Buddhism. It's the teachings the Buddhas gave us that lives on." So then we get to the Buddha's last words. He died peacefully. His head was pointed to the north, his face to the west. The stories tell how the earth shook and the tree suddenly burst into white blossoms, their petals falling gently on his still body, falling out of reverence. Divine coral flowers and divine sandalwood powders fell from above on the Buddha's body out of great reverence. So this idea of white, I didn't know we use white chrysanthemums a lot at funerals. So this color white is associated with the Buddha's death. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting, there's a lot of puns in Japanese because there's only so many sounds. There's a lot of synonyms and homonyms and homophones. I looked that up once, and scholars argue about which one's which. But words sound like the same word for many different meanings. Kiku means to listen to the Dharma, to hear. It's a verb. And then the word for chrysanthemum is kiku. So it's a pun. These are listening flowers. They represent to listen. And in a lot of Buddhist traditions, they wear white at funerals. We don't. We wear black. And there's reasons for this. But like the Vietnamese tradition, they wear white to their funerals. And I would have thought they were going to a wedding, but that's my Western orientation. There's a lot of white because of these flowers that fell when the Buddha died. So I have told you, everything means something. And the other thing the Buddha didn't do that you would think he might do, he didn't name a successor. He didn't name a successor. So this is another sign that it's not a cult of personality. It's not a personal, we're not following a person. We're following a path and teachings. And any thoughts or comments?
For me personally, I find the topic of nirvana, partial nirvana, it very unsettling in a personal way. Everything we usually talk about is being on the path and helping us on the path. But to me, when you talk about nirvana, partial nirvana, and the Buddha, there's a spectrum, and you can see him, partial nirvana, 35, full nirvana, 80 when you pass. And for me, it's my nature to compare myself, because I could see a spectrum now, and to find where I am in the spectrum and where other people are, and I don't like it, because instead of being on the path, I'm marking where I'm at on the path and where other people are, and it brings out like it brings out a comparison, like how enlightened am I and where should I be? The Buddha was 35 and he was already partially enlightened. I'm 60 now, and I think, wow, I'm really behind the 8 ball. But maybe it's just a personal thing, but I'd rather just talk about being on the path. I know you need to explain things to people, but for me personally, it makes me feel uncomfortable.
So I didn't hit this note hard enough, but I really think when the Buddha realized awakening under the Bodhi tree, that's when he was committed to being on the path.
Okay.
So that is when he said, I'm all in, this is who I am, and this is what I'm going to do. And he practiced. Buddhism is practice. So he lives the Dharma by practicing it every day. And then dying and death has always been important to people and concerned about it, even back in India. So this idea, I do think something profound happens when you die. I've said that my father had like an epiphany a week before he died. But I think what the Buddha is saying is you really want to have that earlier in life and change the way you live. I mean, it's really good that he realized that before he died, but it was kind of sad too, because there wasn't a lot he could do about it. So I think the Buddha is saying, even Shinran talks like this, I think everybody goes to the same place. We really don't have to worry about what happens when we die. We need to worry about having the right orientation in our life and practicing and being on a path. And so in Buddhism, being on the path is what Buddhists do, right? It's like, if you run or if you play guitar, you are a musician. It's something you do. It's not a state. So I think if we, we need to reinterpret this story the way you're speaking. You come to church every day. It's an important part of your life. Somewhere in the past, you committed to this, and it became a priority for you.
That's why I think I feel the most peace when I don't even talk about nirvana. It's almost like saying I want to go to Mars and knowing I'll never make it probably.
But I think the word nirvana has gotten inflated. That's what I'm trying to say. I think the meaning of that word has been inflated to this lofty, impossible thing that nobody could reach, when it was basically the Buddha just finally committing and orienting. Because for 6 years, he was trying lots of different practices. He was going to lots of different students, a lot of different teachers. Before I came to OCBC, I ran marathons, I played guitar. I was searching for something of meaning, but nothing stuck. Nothing. There was no staying power. And then when I found Buddhism, I realized that this is what I've been looking for. That this is the thing that I can do for the rest of my life that has a deep impact. And I felt like a connection. So, I wouldn't use the word nirvana or enlightenment or any of that, because those words have been, kind of I think when we oversell those, then it seems like something that no one can do. And I think that's a mistake. I think that the story's been told. I wouldn't aggrandize it like that. It's not some ideal that no one could reach.
Kevin, just your question is a great one. So in Jodo Shinshu, we're on the path. We realize self-awareness. That's all that's necessary.
Yeah.
Self-awareness.
And
so
there's also that paradox. The more you realize your ignorance, anger, and greed, the more you realize how poorly you're doing, the more self-aware you are, and the less it's going to interrupt a healthy and meaningful life if you're aware. So, at meditation service, a lot of people say, I think I'm doing worse now. They do. I'm doing worse now because I'm seeing all this stuff I'm thinking that's not very nice. And I'm like, oh, you've been thinking that your whole life. You just know it now. And once you know it, then you can deal with it. I did a Christmas Carol yesterday at Shotsky. You find out that Ebenezer Scrooge hates his nephew because he looks too much like his mother. And his mother is Ebenezer's sister. It's a little complicated. I need a chart. But Ebenezer realizes he hates his nephew because it reminds him too much of his sister. So he's not evil. He just doesn't realize what's going on in his life. And he realizes awakening on Christmas morning. He's still got issues, but his whole life and his whole orientation has completely changed. He's now on the path. He's on his way. Oh.
I understand what you're saying, and for me, Buddhism seems to be a series of interpretations, which often leads to contradictions. And so, when I'm thinking about it, I am more comfortable not thinking about it. And then I realize that the truth or the path and all of these terms that you come across is confusing, but it seems that the path is in the middle of that confusion. And so I'm just letting it be or be confused, and then I figure something's gonna show up, which it does.
Right.
Then I get more confused, and then it leaves, and then something else comes back. But I hear what you're saying, which is the path is just discovery and continuation, awareness.
And I think this is what Shinran was saying, right? We're just ordinary foolish beings, like Jim said, that reflect on ourselves, and we just practice. And that's as good as it gets. And when you die, everybody goes back to the ocean. So,
I think he brought up a great point, and I love everything that he also had to say, because it also reminds me of something that you talked about quite a while ago, and I'm not really sure which Dharma Talk it was, but it was about self-awareness, which I think is more in line with what you are telling us way we should look at enlightenment, because that is like the first step. I remember you talked about, awareness and saying, like, if you realize, hey, I'm not a very patient person. The point is not to beat yourself up because you're not very patient, although I'm really good at beating myself up. That's one of my many great talents, that and spending money. But you also said that by realizing, for instance, that you're not patient, just that mere realization automatically will, if you're committed in your heart, even though if you're not like trying to force yourself, right, you will just naturally become more patient just by, having that awareness and admitting that you're not that patient. And I'm really not that patient.
Oh, Seiji? It's funny, the questions always get asked in opposite corners of the Hondo.
So I'm going to do my usual thing where I ask like a 2-hour answer kind of a question in the last 5 minutes.
I've noticed that in the YouTube videos too.
So having established that Gautama Buddha, even after being on the path to enlightenment, was very human, right, and all the human temptations were there, who then is Amita Buddha, and how does Amita Buddha fit into our practice?
So I thought about this too. If you glorify or aggrandize the Buddha to be a deity, then some schools of Buddhism look at the historical Buddha as unique in human history, right? He's a unique human being, and nobody can do what he did. It's impossible. But in the Mahayana tradition, this idea that many people are on the path and many people are practicing, then I think Mahayana Buddhism is kind of elevating and glorifying the content of the Buddha's awakening. That he woke up to this infinite truth of impermanence and the flow of reality. So Amita Buddha is kind of a mythical character that represents enlightenment or truth or the ocean itself, kind of compelling us to see things the way they truly are. So Amita Buddha is a mythical Buddha. You could argue that he's kind of playing the role of the philosophical idea of Buddha nature, that Amita Buddha's story is kind of a way of explaining this complex philosophical thing in Buddhism called Buddha nature, but through a story. So, like Star Wars, Darth Vader, right? Darth Vader, I think, is the hero of Star Wars. He's the good guy. He's the one who vanquished the Emperor, and he finally saw that clearly as he ended his life. So, Star Wars isn't true, but it tells this deep human story of self-reflection and redemption. And so Amita Buddha represents ultimate reality, the ocean of truth, the sustaining, all the causes and conditions that sustain our lives.
The story is not historical, but we would say it is true in a deeper sense.
Yeah. It's like Joseph Campbell. It's not historically true, but it's profoundly true in the story of what it means to be human.
So the gentleman who said, well, like, I'm 60 and still not realized the path, kind of. So I was, as a child, also going to the school and asking the questions to the monks. The Buddha was like say 27 years, and in his whole palace, there will be the people, like old people. His father itself was like, say 35 plus or 40 plus. So there were old people. How come he didn't see the old people? When in the stories we hear, oh, Buddha never saw the old person or sick person. The monk said he might have seen, but he have not realized that there is old age or there is just sickness. So this realization brings you kind of different kind of awareness. And that's the thing, like at what age or what point of time do you realize that there is something is happening or something needs to be done? And in one of the, our talk, Dharma Talk, the Reverend Herada said, there was one mayor who was like frustrated with his life, but angry all the time. And he's wasted his whole life, and then one girl tells him that, oh, you're just waste of time, and he realizes that he can do something about his last days, and he starts building the park for the kids, and that's where he gets kind of awareness that add a meaning to his life. So that's what I'm saying. What time you realize is the awareness, our path to awareness.
Right. That was a statement. Yes. That's very good.
That
Very
was
good.
the movie Ikiru.
Yeah, Ikidu.
Following up on what you just said, I think it's interesting the Buddha starts on this path at 35. He's now an adult, and he had the first 35 years. Now we know men mature a little bit later than women. And so it just even stands to reason, just even from a humanistic standpoint, that at 35 is a good age where you start paying attention to things that you just took for granted before. Right? And so
Yeah.
you're saying he finally notices that people are getting old, and he doesn't even notice that until 35. Well, maybe people, when you hit the 35-year-old mark, people start dying that you never had anybody die in your life until you reach a certain age, typically.
Right.
You know, so just if you just look at it from a humanistic standpoint, it makes total sense that at 35 he starts experiencing something that he paid no attention to before, and that awareness of being human and all the follies that come with it, it makes sense from a humanistic standpoint.
Right. So I don't think I've told this story before, but I started to practice when I was 38. But when I was 33, my dad died of alcoholism, and then my best friend committed suicide, and then my boss's wife died in a T-bone. She got hit in a T-bone accident on her 30th wedding anniversary, going to ride horses in Tustin. So it was like that. It was like 3 deaths, bang, bang, bang. And I remember I picked my son up from daycare, Teague, and we went to the beach, and he was only, he was only like 3 or 4. And I remember sitting at the beach thinking, there's something going on. This is bad. Like, I just can't keep going to work every day and pretend that everything's fine. Now, I didn't find OCBC until 6 years later, but I just knew something bad. There's something happening, and I don't have a handle on it, and I just can't keep going the way I'm going. And, those kind of things happen.
Quick comment. I've been realizing lately how angry I am. And what I noticed is that coming from Christianity, I was still angry back then, but I looked at it from much more of a righteous perspective, that I was angry for the right things. And now that I've been meditating more, I've been realizing I'm just angry. And is that really productive, or is there something that can be shared with that? And I'm developing a show titled The Funeral of Your Dreams, where I'll be working through that. And my mom asked me, that sounds so sad. Aren't you going to leave them with something? And I said that I feel like I'll be leaving them with what they already came with. They'll just recognize it for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Thank you.
Anyone else? No? Okay, we'll close with Gasho. Thank you. Namo Amida Buddha. Naman Davats, Naman Davats, Naman Davats. I'll be here for a while if anybody has any questions or comments or